I'm Barbara Salisbury, the Administrative Dean of the Kennedy School. Tonight, it is my pleasure to introduce Kate Michaelman, the President of Naral, the National Abortion Rights Action League, who has come to talk to us about women's issues in the '92 elections. Ms. Michaelman is eminently qualified to speak on the subject as a leader in the women's movement for many years and the head of an organization that has been a major force in getting pro-choice candidates elected nationwide. Ms. Michaelman appears regularly on network news programs discussing issues of concern to women and has been brought to speak with us today through the efforts of the Women's Caucus along with the Institute of Politics. I know that we all look forward to hearing what she has to say and that you will join me in welcoming Kate Michaelman. Kate.
Thank you very much. That was a very nice and warm welcome. And I'm delighted to be here for lots of reasons. It's very special to be at Harvard, and I'm excited about the new group that is formed here at the Kennedy School, a pro-choice group. If ever it was needed, it's needed now. I also get to see a very special and wonderful friend of mine. So there are lots of good reasons to be here tonight, among which we need to talk about the situation we face out here in the world. It may look grim, because it is. It's a very grim-looking future right now, but we can make a difference, and I'm going to talk about how. But first, I really do want to spend some time just paying attention to what it is we face, focus particularly on the status of women. The history of the women's rights movement in the United States is filled with struggle. Women had to fight to win the right to own property, to be educated, to vote, and to serve on juries. It wasn't until 1965 that we actually won the right to use birth control, and we are still struggling today for the right to make our own decisions about our own reproductive lives and futures. As we approach the 21st century, the struggles continue. Our nation's policies and programs are woefully inadequate to address the changing reality of women's lives. Right now, Congress is trying for the second time to craft a bill that President Bush won't veto that would give women unpaid, mind you, unpaid family leave. Our child care policies lag far behind those of other industrialized nations. The wage gap persists because the vast majority of employed women are trapped in low-paying, dead-end jobs. A report issued just last week by AAUW chronicles the continuing dangerous inequities in our educational system. Social Security and other retirement income programs penalize women who must take time out of the workforce to provide child or elder care. The Civil Rights Act that Congress just passed last year, finally I should say passed, puts a cap on the remedies that victims of gender-based employment discrimination can collect, but no cap on remedies for victims of other forms of discrimination. They singled out women to put a cap on their challenges. And the fundamental right to choose, the cornerstone of women's rights and freedoms, is under assault on every front. After more than a century of struggle, women can still can hope only for incremental policy improvements while desperately trying to protect hard-won gains of the past. Now, why, in a nation that treasures freedom and liberty, is the march toward equality so excruciatingly slow? Why, when women's issues reflect the concerns of families in mainstream America, do initiatives that promote equity seem to be permanently stalled? Obviously, we can't dissect this in one evening's discussion, but let me try and shed a little light on the reasons why. The reasons include the fact that women's evolving role in society challenges established views of what those roles should be. And the New Right has responded to that challenge with a sophisticated campaign to demonize women and pit disadvantaged groups one against the other. Women's role in society has changed dramatically in a relatively short time. The most significant demographic shift this century may be the massive influx of women into the labor force. That shift was born of both economic necessity and desire, but public policies have utterly failed to support the emerging reality of women's lives. The lack of affordable, accessible, quality child care and the failure to enact family leave policies force women who are struggling to balance work and family to make impossible choices. Employed women must invent their own child care support systems, relying on family, friends, neighbors, and disorganized networks of low-paid caregivers. Recent history has seen a stream of what I call first women, from corporate presidents to astronauts to a vice presidential candidate to women presidential campaign managers. But that progress has masked the reality that after those first women open the doors, few others are able to follow. Women's entry into the workforce has recast roles in society, reapportioned economic power, redefined the family dynamic, and created a new phenomena like latchkey children and time-pinched, overtired working moms. Policies, though, do not address women's needs, in part because policymakers are overwhelmingly male. Just 2 of the 100 members of the United States Senate are women. The House of Representatives is less than 7% female, and only 3 governors and the District of Columbia mayor are women. Women are as scarce in corporate boardrooms as in the halls of power. And policies do not address women's needs because a sophisticated and effective right-wing counter-assault has exacerbated the turmoil surrounding the evolution and advancement of women in our society. Journalist Susan Faludi addresses this phenomenon in her powerful and insightful new book, Backlash, correctly describing the campaign to obstruct women's progress as a virtual tidal wave that is out of all proportion to the minimal progress women actually have achieved. The ascension of Ronald Reagan, which I think, by the way, was a turning point in our society that we're only going to come to grasp after much deeper and further analysis. But his ascension in '80 validated and gave legitimacy to the New Right, providing a powerful forum from which they could shift the political debate and launch their attack. I remember in 1988, I think it was, I can't remember now, it was 88, I think, I wrote an op-ed piece that was published in the Chicago Tribune that talked about the almost imperceptible movement of right-wing extremists to front and center stage. And I used Patrick Buchanan in 1988, that I know he was going to be running for president in 1992, as an example of how he used to be considered off on the fringe over here, writing this nutty stuff. I mean, really nutty stuff that I hope somebody's going to start publicizing now. I mean, you know, he has written some very dangerous thoughts. But we used to consider him off over here. And all of a sudden, he becomes a central communicator. He's on Crossfire. He's on McLaughlin. He's on, you know, he is defining in many ways the terms of the debate. And none of us sort of noticed. It's scary. I thought it was scary then. I think it's a lot more scary now that I've done a little more research. Suddenly, women were no longer able to work for small steps forward after Ronald Reagan ascended the throne, but instead had to work to protect past gains. The New Right counter-assault gathered momentum in the early 1980s when it successfully blocked ratification of the Equal Rights Amendment, shifting that debate away from the real issues like the wage gap and focusing instead on bogus issues like unisex toilets and women in foxholes. And for those of you who might not remember, that's exactly what happened. Success emboldened the right-wing leaders who began spouting what Faludi calls, and I quote, the new findings of scientific research and the dime store moralism of yesteryear, turning into media sound bites both the glib pronouncement of pop psych trend watchers and the frenzied rhetoric of new right preachers. We saw an example of the demonization of women last summer when the Bush administration launched a feeding frenzy against Professor Anita Hill, who dared to challenge a power figure. There was a modern-day witch hunt against Hill's character, integrity, and credibility. Members of the United States Senate went on national TV to discuss psychological disorders in which young women fantasize about their bosses. Hill, they said, was a scorned woman, a pawn of the left wing, a perjurer, and a calculating witch. When it was over, Clarence Thomas had won a lifetime appointment on our highest court. Women had gotten the message about speaking out, and we were all insulted and degraded in one way or another, and we all saw how much of the struggle for equality was yet left for us to win. Little footnote here. I do this, by the way. I don't know if you've read about the decision that was just released that Thomas wrote when he was in the federal court before he ascended to the new throne that he sits on, a discrimination case against women. They held it up, by the way. They held it up on purpose. They held it up so that it was not released during his confirmation hearings. It's a terrible decision against women. It's an FEC case anyway. So you can see where he's heading. Anyway, engaging in the time-worn process of blaming the victim, new right leaders have labeled proponents of women's equality confused, selfish, and anti-family. They have worked tirelessly to capture the banner of family values by demonizing women and blaming us for a host of social and economic problems. Rather than acknowledging that women's real problem is that equality and respect remain but a distant dream, the popular culture has collaborated by purveying a barrage of theories that pin women's frustration and dissatisfaction on our ambitions, inadequacies, and lifestyles. So, family leave is cast as an unfair burden on business. Childcare is equated with a host of developmental and behavioral problems. You've heard this. Women who put their children into childcare create problems for their children. And abortion is ostensibly nothing more than a sacrilegious act of cruel selfishness. Obviously, nothing could be further from the truth. But the new right, led by the Heritage Foundation and its allies, has worked tirelessly to permeate the popular culture with these hostile and negative views about women. And for 13 years, they have had support from the White House. In fact, by the way, the Heritage Foundation has permeated the top policy seats of these last three administrations. They have infiltrated every level of policy decision-making in this nation. They have been behind the change in the federal courts, not just the Supreme Court, but all the federal judiciary. They have been behind the selection of key people for key posts. They have signed off on, they've given a list and they've signed off on the final candidate. It's very scary. The right-wing's success in recasting the national debate can now be measured by the fact that there is now an entire generation of young women in this nation who endorse the principles of equality but refuse to affiliate them with the term feminist. The counter-assault has concentrated enormous energy and resources on taking away our right to choose, because the new right leaders recognize that this right is the very foundation of women's ability to exercise self-determination and autonomy. Opponents of women's advancements know that without the fundamental right to reproductive choice, women cannot truly have control over our lives and futures. When Operation Rescue leader Randall Terry said that his goal was to return women to their biblically ordained role, you can guess what that is. He said it, I didn't, to serve men. He spoke volumes about the new rights goals and about how little they value women's choices, women's contributions, and indeed women's lives. If we truly valued women's lives, our nation would make it a priority to reduce the need for abortion, to make abortion less necessary, not more dangerous, and not more difficult. Our policymakers would formulate coherent, responsible policies that address the social condition that cause 3 million American women to face unintended pregnancies each year. They wouldn't try to take away the right to choose once a pregnancy occurs. Instead, they would try to make it possible for fewer women to even have to face the decision. We would ensure better sex education, improve birth control, increase contraceptive research, better prenatal care, and stronger family leave and daycare policies. It is pro-choice Americans, not the right wing, who are working to build a consensus for comprehensive and coherent reproductive health care program that meets the real needs of Americans. Public officials should support these responsible health policies and respect our fundamental rights and liberties. We will not and we cannot allow the right-wing minority or anyone else to take away our right to choose. The 1973 U.S. Supreme Court ruling in Roe v. Wade that recognized women's fundamental right to choose was, I believe, one of, if not the, most important ruling affecting women's lives. It saved women from the shame, degradation, and horror of self-induced knitting needle abortions, of coat hangers and dirty kitchen tables, of the deadly back alleys. I choose those words very deliberately. I think it's time for us to start talking about what women suffered. I think there are too many of us that have conveniently forgotten or are afraid to use the language because we don't want to seem extreme. But it's not extreme. These were real women who died or suffered and were maimed because of the conditions that they found themselves in and had no recourse to change. Roe gave women control over our futures and established our most fundamental liberty. The debate over reproductive rights that is raging in America today is really not about abortion, but about our rights and our freedoms. Women cannot advance, can never achieve equality without the fundamental right to choose. It is an essential foundation to our ability to participate fully and equally with men as partners in the socio-economic life of this nation. Today, the right wing, I think, is winning some of these battles. They're not winning the war, they're winning the battles. Losing this fundamental right is no longer distant and inconceivable, it's immediate and inevitable. 10 years ago, if I had said to anyone, the court is going to take away this right to choose, we've been saying that, right, Carol? Nobody believed us. And if I had said 5 years ago that we're going to live in a nation where doctors cannot talk to their patients about a medical procedure that could actually save the health of women because they work in a federally funded family, you would have said, it's crazy. For the first time in history, Americans are losing a fundamental constitutional right, and we can blame the Bush and Reagan administrations and all of the organizations that have supported them. After 12 years of court packing by Presidents Bush and Reagan, the Supreme Court is about to hear a challenge to legal abortion. It doesn't matter if the court says it outright. You know, the press have been waging this sort of debate about, well, the court's really not going to overturn Roe explicitly. It's just going to uphold the provisions in the Pennsylvania law, but it's really not going to overturn Roe. It's a stupid argument. The fact is, if they uphold Pennsylvania law, we have no fundamental right to choose. But is the court going to write, we hereby overrule Roe versus Wade? No, of course not. They're not going to do that. They're not going to do that. But they are going to uphold Pennsylvania, or at least some of the provisions in Pennsylvania. And when they do it, we lose our right to choose. And I want to just go on record saying this so that when you start reading the day of the decision, you have to sort of rise above the din of the press. Oh, well, they didn't really overturn Roe. Well, it doesn't matter. We lost our right to choose, whether they said it or not. But it doesn't matter if the court says it outright, or if it's this year's case from Pennsylvania, or next year's cases from Guam, Louisiana, Utah, North Dakota, or Mississippi. If the court tears one more time at Roe versus Wade, we will have no fundamental right to choose. America will become an infinitely more dangerous place for women, and the drive toward equality will be stopped in its tracks. And this isn't an abstract or legalistic issue. This is about our health, our lives, and our futures. 15 million women are at immediate risk of losing their right to choose, of having their health, their lives, and their families' futures jeopardized by a crisis pregnancy. Those women live in states that will likely ban abortion immediately after the court acts in the Pennsylvania case to give states more power to take away this right or to restrict it. But in reality, if the Supreme Court gives politicians the power to take away our right to choose, every woman in every state will lose. Just last year, Louisiana enacted a 19th century law. 19th century, it was like 1848 law. They reenacted it, a law that punishes doctors who perform abortions with 10 years at hard labor. Louisiana's statute also outlaws many forms of birth control. Utah passed an abortion ban that originally, in its original conception, they actually passed this abortion ban with the death that included the death penalty for women and doctors. Now, when we discovered this, and by the way, we couldn't get, they have a very interesting legislative process in Utah. It's not too open. So, you know, we're there, we tried to get copies of the bill so that we could, you know, that we could at least, you can't do too much in Utah, but there are, you know, we wanted to at least know what it said so we can begin to act on it. But we couldn't get a copy of the bill. They wouldn't, you know, the committees wouldn't surface the bill. It was terrible. We finally did get a copy of the bill, and it was only through the reading by our lawyers that we discovered that the bill was related to a criminal statute in the state passed in some like 1973 or 4 or 5 that gave the death penalty to the doctor and the woman. And they shoot people in Utah, by the way. But they, to be fair to them, I don't think they all really realized what they had done. I mean, I have to be fair, and I do want to be fair. I don't think, I'd like to believe they did not do this intentionally, but probably some of them did. Some smart lawyer probably knew, anti-abortion lawyer. But anyway, we found it and started to tell the press, and the governor called them back into session, and they did a new bill. I mean, but I mean, that's what happens when these issues go before these Neanderthal people like David Duke, and I think some of them are Neanderthals. Anyway, what has happened in states like Louisiana and Utah makes the tragedy unfolding in Ireland, where a 14-year-old rape victim has been barred from traveling to Britain for an abortion, seem much less distant. In fact, I think we could talk about Romania for a while and consider what it would be like to live in a country that had the laws that they had. We must remember that the same government that can ban abortion can force women to have abortions against their will. Because this really is about who makes these decisions, who decides, women or government and politicians. America is on the very brink of facing a world without Roe, a world in which government already censors communication, a world in which poor women are denied health care information, a world in which government intrudes into these deeply personal decisions, a world in which women are forced into pregnancy and childbirth against their will, a world in which women take a giant step backward to a dangerous past. From Wichita last summer, Americans saw the counter-assault against women up close when Operation Rescue vigilantes broke the law, tormenting and harassing women and healthcare workers who tried to enter the healthcare clinics for pregnancy tests, pap smears, birth control, as well as for abortions. Kansas's governor welcomed Operation Rescue to town, and when women's rights were being violated, George Bush sent in his Justice Department on the side of the lawbreakers. Now, when Iraq violated Kuwait's rights, he sent the Marines in to protect Kuwait, or the Army, or whoever he sent. But when women's rights were being violated and the health, the clinic workers' rights were being violated, he sent his Justice Department in to defend Operation Rescue's right to do that. The deliberate campaign of harassment and intimidation against doctors is having a dramatic effect. In Randall Terry's hometown of Binghamton, no doctor will run the gauntlet of terror and intimidation. In the majority of America's rural counties, no doctors perform abortions, 80% to be exact. America with Randall Terry run amok is a cruel place. America without the choice of legal abortion is crueler still. It is teens, the poor, rural, working-class women who will pay the highest price. I know because I was one of those women. I know firsthand how absolutely central reproductive choice is to the entire fabric of women's lives. Before Roe, I had an abortion. I was relatively lucky. I was able to avoid resorting to the back alleys. But I suffered the shame and degradation of living in a world where the government denied women the right to choose. Like most women, I never thought I would need an abortion. I don't think we start out thinking we're going to have an abortion in our lives. It's not something we believe we'll have to face often. But before Roe versus Wade, I faced the trauma of a crisis pregnancy. I was raised Catholic, and as a young woman, I had 3 wonderful daughters in 3 years. Good Catholic, that is. No family planning in that birth control, I mean, until after the 3rd one, and then I thought the church is crazy. Anyway, in 1970, my husband suddenly abandoned me and my daughters. Obviously, I was devastated. Without money, a job, or a car, I was even unable to get a charge account at the local 5 and Dime to buy my daughters school supplies. I was also very ill at the time. My self-esteem was utterly destroyed, my entire world shattered. My family was forced onto welfare. Shortly after my husband left me and my daughters, I discovered that I was pregnant. With 3 children under the age of 6, I alone had to meet their every need: financial, emotional, psychological, physical. Because abortion was illegal at the time, I had to struggle with this decision alone. And I've never been so lonely in my life, I must tell you. Couldn't tell my parents, they were Catholic. Couldn't tell anybody because you felt terrible. The circumstance was so terrible, you were just, it was terrible. Yeah, it was terrible. And my family's survival was at stake. Deciding whether or not to have an abortion, for me, it's not for every woman, but for me, was one of the most difficult and complex decisions I ever have faced. It challenged many religious, moral, philosophical, and ethical beliefs I had held. I had to weigh the moral responsibilities to support, care for, nurture, feed my 3 daughters against the moral responsibilities I had to that developing fetus. I looked into the eyes of my 3 daughters and made what I think is one of the most moral decisions I have ever made. Their very security was at stake. Another child would have had a great devastation from which I could not have recovered. But in 1970, the government would not allow me to make this decision for myself. I was forced to appear before a hospital-appointed panel of 4 doctors, male doctors. These complete strangers cross-examined me about the most intimate and personal details of my life, and it was humiliating. I was an adult woman, a mother of 3, and yet I had to win their permission to make a decision that I had already made to carry out, a decision that would affect my future, my family's future, and my life. And I alone would have to live with the consequences of the decision that they made. They finally granted their permission. I was admitted to the hospital, yet as I awaited the procedure, I was told that they had forgotten one more legal requirement. I would have to have the written permission from the man who had abandoned me and my daughters before they would perform the procedure. I literally had to leave the hospital. I had already gotten into the hospital room. I would have to leave the hospital and go and find him and get his permission. It was a degrading, dehumanizing experience, an assault to my integrity, my dignity, my sense of self, which I didn't have much left. As you grow up in the 50s, you were told pretty clearly that your worth was when you got married. You know, someone chose you, and when someone leaves you for someone else, you sort of get destroyed. So to have to go through all of this is all about what it's like to be a woman in this society. At all times, by the way, during this process, I carried with me the phone number of an illegal abortionist because I was ready to risk my life and break the law because my family's survival depended on it. So if I had not gotten permission to have a hospital abortion, I would have done that. Now, mind you, when the hospital panel gave me their permission, you know what they did in those days? What they did in those days was they rendered you sort of psychiatrically, psychologically unfit to have a pregnancy and be a mother or however, in order to grant you a hospital abortion. You had to be rendered. And I've learned through research since that time that those decisions on record came back to haunt women later on, that they were then in court cases later, they were used, it was resurrected to be used against them in child support cases. I don't know. It was awful. Anyway, in the end, I avoided the back alley. But if opponents of choice win, we will lose the right to medically safe abortion, and some of you may not avoid. If the court allows enactment of laws like Pennsylvania's, many more women will endure ordeals like mine or have to resort to self-induced or back alley abortions. And by the way, the Pennsylvania law that is before the court right now are the same kind of laws that existed prior to Roe versus Wade. Some were much worse. Some were like the law is stated today. If people say that spousal consent is really a moderate restriction on the right to choose, remember my experience. If people say that 24-hour or 48-hour waiting periods don't sound so bad, remind them that there are poor women in rural South Dakota without money to stay overnight at a hotel who already must drive hours to the nearest health care facility that performs abortion and then turn around and drive home. And if people say that teenagers should talk to their parents before making decisions about abortions, tell them that pro-choice people agree and that the vast majority of teenagers already do. But tell them also that mandatory parental involvement laws affects teenagers like Spring Adams, an Idaho 6th grader whose father raped and impregnated her. And when he found out that she was trying to get an abortion, he shot and killed her. And mandatory parental involvement laws affect teens like Becky Bell of Indiana, who refused medical help as she lay dying of complications from a back alley abortion in 1989 because she could not bear for her parents to know that she had been pregnant. We must recognize that opponents of choice and of women's equality try to divide and conquer. They count on urban women not to care about the waiting periods that deny fundamental rights to rural women. They count on women of means, like us, not to care if poor women are forced to choose between compulsory pregnancy and childbirth or the back alleys. Our imperative is to show that we do indeed care and that we will defend our rights in every way possible, certainly defend them at the polls. With the court about to decide whether the Constitution will continue to protect women's privacy, our health, and our lives, we must use the power of our votes to protect our freedom. With our right to choose on the chopping block, every pro-choice American has a responsibility to become an activist and an advocate. Our challenge this November and in the Novembers ahead is to demonstrate that we recognize securing the right to choose means protecting our most personal decisions and basic rights and saving lives. It means trusting women to have the moral integrity and intelligence to make our own decisions about the most fundamental aspect of our lives. It also means honoring our nation's founding principles: privacy, free speech, freedom of conscience, and the separation of church and state that allows religious freedom to flourish. It means taking a vital step towards securing full equality for women. It means taking our destiny into our own hands and electing a Congress and a president who will enact the Freedom of Choice Act and put the guarantees of Roe v. Wade beyond the reach of state legislators like David Duke. 4 years ago, George Bush promised us a kinder and gentler nation. That was absolute rhetoric. The reality is that George Bush, and I thought I'd never hear myself say this after Ronald Reagan, that George Bush has been the most anti-woman, anti-choice president in the nation's history. George Bush handed Clarence Thomas a lifetime appointment on our highest court. George Bush vetoed the Family and Medical Leave Act. George Bush violated the fundamental right of free speech and imposed a gag rule on doctors with their patients at family planning clinics. George Bush thwarted Congress in denying funding of medically safe abortions for rape and incest victims on Medicaid. And George Bush sent his Justice Department into court on the side of Operation Rescue. George Bush hasn't been a kinder, gentler president at all. He is the president who has led a right-wing war against women. Women do have, however, the power and the influence to fight back. In no small part, because of women, health care is emerging as a dominant electoral issue, and the right to choose has become the single most politically powerful social issue to emerge on the electoral scene in years. Our challenge is enormous. We must readjust public attitudes and reassess policies in the face of a right-wing campaign that is tantamount to an assault on the very fabric of women's lives. Now more than ever, women must make the personal political. We must continue the struggle toward equality and take back the terms of the debate. We must elect officials who understand and respect our needs, who recognize that women's interests are legitimate interests and not single interests or special interests. We must remember what it was like when the suffragists were fighting year after year for the right to vote. They didn't get the right to vote through the courts. In fact, the courts didn't want women to vote. They didn't see the Constitution provided for women to vote. They just made pests of themselves until, darn it, they won the right to vote through organized, deliberate political action. They were clear, they were focused, and they got thwarted every step of the way, and they suffered defeats along the way, but they got it. And that is where we are today. We did win in 1973, but we, because of political, change in the society, we are now going to lose that right, but we can get it back, and I'm absolutely certain of that. George Bush has been talking about what will not stand. Did you hear his speech to the Union, or State of the Union speech? He kept saying, that will not stand. I actually didn't know quite what he meant when he said that until I read the announcement. I didn't know what he was talking about, actually, but I guess it referred to his Persian Gulf War or something. But anyway, he did. He keeps talking about what will not stand. Let me tell you what will stand. We will. We will stand to preserve the legacy of liberty, to protect the ideal of individual freedom, and to continue the struggle for equality. This is a promise I make to you and to my daughters. We will withstand the backlash, the counter-assault. We will endure. We will secure the right to choose. We will continue the march toward equality, and we will prevail. Thank you. Thanks. Thank you. Thank you so much. Thank you. We won't prevail, though, if you all don't get going.
Ms. Michaelman has agreed to take questions. We have 2 mics set up down here, and we will alternate one mic to the other. Yes?
For those of us who have been too busy writing papers to read them, could you say a little more about the about Clarence Thomas's FEC decision that was held back?
Yes, it was a help me out, for those of you who are lawyers and who may know this decision better. I have not actually read the decision, but it had to do with set-asides for women, broadcast licensing for women. It's right here in the paper. Right here, I should. And he struck down the. Where'd you go? Oh, there you are. I'm sorry, I lost you. He struck down the affirmative action regulation, protecting women's rights to to equalize the regulatory process, so that women were guaranteed to be able to have broadcasting licensing. And he struck it down. We knew about the case. We knew, those of us who were working against Clarence Thomas, we knew about it, and we tried to get it surfaced. Trying to get it out. We were actually, people who know these courts in Washington were trying to get the court to issue the decision. They held it deliberately. You also know that there was a very bad civil rights decision about 2-3 weeks ago on voting rights. And it was a terrible decision, and he voted with the majority on that decision. Look, there's no question where Clarence Thomas is. I mean, aside from not being the best qualified, he is going to be a little Scalia. I mean, he is. I'm sorry.
He is already little.
Yeah, Ms. Michaelman, I have a quick comment and a question. First of all, to be partisan, I volunteered in Wichita this summer, and I'd like to thank Naral for the support.
Oh, bless your heart.
I'd like to thank Naral for the support you gave the Pro-Choice Action League, especially on the airwaves, and I hope other communities that find themselves in the same situation in the future, you get the same degree of support. My question is, since Roe appears to be headed for a gutting, I was wondering what you thought about possibly pursuing as a tactic going to individual states and through the initiative and referendum process trying to establish right to privacy amendments and amendments that would protect the right to choose?
A very good question, and by the way, thank you for the work you did. The assault in Wichita was terrible. I will tell you very quickly that they're planning another just like Wichita in Buffalo from late April into May. We are ahead of the game, I hope, this time. We've got a plan ready to go. We're going to run our ads immediately, but we're organizing the public officials there, but they're planning on a big deal. There are only 2 clinics in Buffalo that provide abortions, and they're heading in there to shut them down. Your question about whether the strategy of going state by state to try to amend the constitutions. There are only 2 states in the Union that have privacy amendments in their constitutions, Florida and California. Each of them has been interpreted to protect a woman's right to choose, even teenagers' rights, which we were very pleased in Florida a couple years ago. It was a very good decision. But let me speak to the idea of trying to do this state by state. First of all, there are very few states right now that would be friendly territory to do an amendment to their constitution. I mean, that's different from having a ballot initiative that puts into law Roe versus Wade in the state but doesn't amend the Constitution. I'm speaking of the amendment of the Constitution is very difficult, just like amending the federal Constitution is very difficult, which I think we need. But it's going to be very difficult to do. The ballot initiative strategy is very expensive. And we are so, we just had one in 1990, or was it 91? I've lost time track. But anyway, in Washington. Well, Washington just had one. And Washington State is very pro-choice. I mean, there's no question we knew we were going to have to spend a lot of money. But you know what? We came a hair's close to losing that initiative. You know why? The other side went on the air and lied to the public. I mean, said that they were pro-choice, that I couldn't believe it. And we almost lost. I think where we can work through the legislative process to pass laws like we did in Connecticut to put the state, put Roe versus Wade into state law like we did in Maryland, that is worth an effort. But we have to decide whether the climate is right. But I must caution against this notion of going state by state. If we buy into the other side's states' rights notion, we are then saying this is not a fundamental right. that we can win. It's like a speed limit, right? You know, one state's 65, another state's 55. We're buying into that. That is why I suggest that our effort has to be aimed at federal legislation, the Freedom of Choice Act. The Constitution lays it out. When the courts don't protect rights, the Congress has the authority, the right, and the obligation to protect rights. They can't establish rights. They can protect rights. They did it in the Civil Rights Act. They've done it in the Disabilities Act. They need to do it with the Freedom of Choice Act. Now, we need a few ingredients to make that happen. We need a pro-choice president to sign it, small little detail. And then we need a veto-proof Congress. And Naral's goals in '92 are to move really deliberately and successfully toward a veto-proof Congress. I must stand here and say I couldn't say honestly we can achieve that in one election cycle. We can make a heavy stab at it. And to elect a pro-choice president. And I don't think that's impossible, though we don't know who our guy's going to be. But so I think the federal solution is important. Then I'll close. Hi. But that doesn't mean we don't keep fighting at the states to protect the status quo while we work on this federal piece. And that's what this march is about on April the 5th, by the way. I hope you're all planning to bring 12,000 people down there. Don't let anybody suggest to you this is a waste of time. This is a historic march. People are out there saying, why waste your resources? I'm not involved in this march and spending all this money because it's the end. The march is a part of a process. It's a statement. It's a political message. It's an ability for Naral affiliates and NOW and Planned Parenthood and others to use the march as an organizing tool. If you make 20 phone calls and you only get one to the march, you've got 20 new people into your political efforts. Don't be fooled by this, oh, it's not a good thing to do. It is. And we've got to have, well, 800,000 anyway. Right? So please come. Hi.
Hi.
How are you?
Good. Just before I ask my question, I just wanted to fill in for those who don't know about the Massachusetts Citizen Initiative petition, which was tried right after the Webster decision in 1989. And the 100,000 signatures were collected, but our Constitution here provides that then it has to go to the legislature, where it doesn't require a majority vote, but it couldn't be gotten past Senator William Bulger, who used all kinds of procedural parliamentary tactics to keep the question itself from ever coming to a vote. So it could not get on the ballot, even though the requisite number of citizens signed a petition saying we want it on the ballot, because the legislature blocked it. So we tried it here, and we aren't going to succeed in amending our state constitution as long as we have an anti-choice majority there and Senator William Bulger as chair of the constitutional conventions. So that's the way it is here. My question, what I was going to add, because I think it's important for women of my generation to say so when it's happened, but I've also had a pre-Roe abortion, and with all the gripping, dramatic details that go with all of those, and it's not something that anybody should want to go back to. My question has to do with causes of what you're talking about, which is results. What we're seeing are the results, I think, of something else that's going on, and I'd like your opinion on it. When we think about the history of the suffrage amendment or the Equal Rights Amendment, belated research showed that it was the business interests, the liquor interests, that prevented the suffrage amendment from being ratified for 70 years, and it was the insurance interests that prevented the Equal Rights Amendment from being ratified. And so I have thought more and more about what are the economic and business interests that are driving this anti-woman, pro-natalist agenda that we're hearing. And I'd like to know what research has been done on this. Where does economic policy and population policy intersect? And how are they adding up and driving this rhetoric that we're hearing? I mean, the capitalistic system depends on getting its natural and human resources at the least possible cost.
Right.
And the way you do that is for women to breed and raise children at no cost.
Well, you've just
And
you've just given, that's what's...
And I mean, that's what it was.
Well,
slavery, black women, it was very explicit during slavery.
Yeah, but part of the research, and some of the research, and I'm not, by the way, an expert in this. I don't want to suggest I am, but from what I have gleaned, that is one of the factors. In fact, Connie Marshner, if some of you know her, worked for the Heritage Foundation. If you read what the Heritage Foundation has done since its establishment in 1973, it'll make your hair stand on end. And a book I recommend to you is a book written by Sidney Blumenthal called The Rise of the Counter-Establishment. And also Susan Faludi gets into some of this as well in her book called Backlash. But Connie Marshner went to corporations and told them, I mean, with her lobby position was you've got to oppose abortion because you'll not have enough people to buy your products, to pay your, you know, to work in your factories. Pat Robertson, I don't know if many of you heard him, or if you did, how many of you have forgotten what he said on one of the shows when he was running for president in 1988. He said, our tax rolls are going to go down. We're not going to have taxes from people. Now, he's forgetting that the people that would be having kids are the people who can't afford, you know, and don't pay as many taxes because they're not in an economic bracket. But that is very much part of what is going on.
Then I guess, why aren't we talking more about it and uncovering and revealing the causes?
We need to start to, I mean, it's not that simple either. That isn't the only reason. There is the anti-sex part of this that goes on. I mean, we are a nation that is still living in a very sort of Victorian notion about sex. We cannot deal with sex openly and well. Other countries do not have the problems that we have on reproductive issues. They do not fight it out in the political arena. They have birth control. They have, and they advertise it. You know, we advertise birth control for roaches, and we can't advertise it for people. That's also tied in. And the right wing has, the new right has made a real campaign of attack on women. There's also this notion about women. I mean, there is a very well-established Western cultural view of our roles, and if we break out of those, it threatens the economic power, and it threatens some other things as well, and then the backlash happens. I mean, so we do need to talk about it. There are people talking about it in academic circles. I mean, through literature and books. It's not on the circuit of speaking. And I'll tell you why. You have to be sort of selective about that kind of, you can start talking about it, but it depends on your audience. You can talk about it here, but often people will think you're crazy if you talk about this stuff. I mean, they just think you're nutty. The fact is, the truth is, it is happening. And it is part of the force. It is more complicated than that. I want to make sure we understand. The economic issues are, though, not talked about enough, and you make a very good point.
Hi. I was wondering, you were speaking before about electing a pro-choice president and a veto-proof Congress, something we'd all like to see. And if you listen to the presidential debates, except for a few mentions of abortion, you really wouldn't know that women were a part of this scene.
Right.
And I was wondering if there was any specific plans that groups like Naral or NOW or Planned Parenthood had to sort of come up with a combined combined something that would convince people that their freedoms and rights are just as much in danger now, if not more so, than they were when Webster came out, and they were able to do that and elect people like Florio and Wilder.
Right. Very good question, and the answer is that Naral certainly is. We already launched. You can tell you don't watch CNN. We have already aired our first 2 new ads. They ran around January 22nd and right through the President's State of the Union and in New Hampshire. These are 2 ads. One of them is an ad that features a Marine who's about 65 years old whose mother died of an illegal abortion. It's a very powerful ad. The other one is an ad that really attacks George Bush's policies. We call it the Doors ad, and it's this long hallway of doors slamming, and the narrator is saying what George Bush is, where he's leading us, and it ends up in a back alley. We need a lot of money to run it, but the plan is to indeed to educate the American public between now and the court's decision that their right is going to be taken away. Then we need to figure out, we need to keep then advertising, mobilizing, doing grassroots organizing to bring these people into campaigns and to get them to vote. Naral is also doing it's an unprecedented program we're doing this year. We are doing a nationwide voter ID. We're targeting states to identify approximately 2 million pro-choice voters who will vote only on this issue, aiming at Republican women, young voters, swing voters, and independents. Now, the purpose here is to target these votes in key states where a Democrat pro-choice member of Congress, a presidential candidate, needs to win the White House. And we will move those voters. Now, why the candidates aren't talking about the issue? Well, let me tell you, you have no idea how hard we have been working on these candidates. I mean, we've actually moved 2 of them to a fully pro-choice position through our work. They really are now fully pro-choice. They will sign on to the Freedom of Choice Act. They will sign the Freedom of Choice Act. They will use the issue. The problem that they've had, and we need to be cognizant of this, in New Hampshire, they only could talk about the economy. That's the issue. The debate, they didn't talk about it in part because it wasn't brought up and because they're not always willing to just get out there. We just have to make sure that every time what we tried to do in New Hampshire was make sure that everywhere they went there were pro-choice signs, that every person that talked to them mentioned the right to choose. It will be an issue, though, believe me, in the general election. The right to choose will be a more important issue in this presidential than ever before. But it's only through our work, not Naral, I mean people like us, that will force them to be responsible to this issue. Now, they know it's a winning issue for them. They know that this issue is going to be an issue. Ron Brown, for instance, 2 weeks ago was at the press club with his counterpart at the RNC. They each were speaking, and they each had the right to invite one guest. He invited me to make a very powerful statement. Well, the point is that he got up then at the press club and he talked about the right to choose as an American value, that the Democratic Party is going to do this and that. And Rick, whatever his name is, I forget, the new head of the RNC, was a really nice guy. He couldn't even, I mean, there's nothing he could do. He couldn't say. So I think you'll see it come out more, but be sure that you talk to the candidates when you have a chance that you're going to vote only for pro-choice candidate. Make them tell you they're pro-choice. All the Democratic candidates are pro-choice. Kerry, Tsongas, Harkin, Clinton, they're all pro-choice, every one of them. And when I say pro-choice, I really mean even including opposing parental notification. Now, you're going to see a little confusion in the press because Clinton can't. Well, no, he isn't waffling exactly. In fact, he had a pro-parental notification stance. And we've gotten him to be, he understands better now why he can't do that. But what he's afraid of is if he comes out and makes a public statement, he looks like he's waffling. So he's sort of being quiet about it. So you're going to see occasionally a little confusion about it, but believe me, he's going to be okay. Listen, any one of them would make a safer place for all of our rights than George Bush.
There's been some contention among the different women, the pro-choice groups, and for an example, here in Boston in the fall when Operation Rescue came, ended up going to Rhode Island, but during the whole, there were a lot of postering around Harvard. I volunteer at the Planned Parenthood Public Information Office, and the way that the groups wanted to deal with Operation Rescue coming was very different. Right. Planned Parenthood's stance was not to send pro-choice people to the clinics to oppose the Operation Rescue groups because it confuses the police, it scares the women who are trying to go to the clinics, and now, and I'm not sure if Naral had the same stance, was send as many pro-choice people down as you can to block them. I'm wondering if, just in general, Naral and as well the other pro-choice groups are making any conscious efforts to deal with these contentions. I know, you brought up the suffrage movement. There was a lot of contention there as well. And I'm just sort of wondering if there are any conscious efforts to bring the groups more together.
There is some disagreement, as you have very nicely outlined, about how to approach these terrorists. And on the one hand, what we worry about is exacerbating the situation. Remember, our first concern are the patients and the medical personnel. The patients being first. We want to make sure they get in, and they get in safely. And Naral's work on this area has always been to very aggressively train clinic escorts. Our whole approach is clinic escorting, and to go there with the intention of really protecting the patient as much as possible, keeping the way open. We have struggled with whether a counter-demonstration is really, or having a lot of pro-choice people at the clinics is really the way to go, because again, you don't want to exacerbate an already bad situation. Also, I feel very strongly that the clinic has a right to sort of, decide to some degree how it wants it handled. I don't think it's fair of us who are enraged to just go down there without consultation with and agreement with the clinic. And we might not like the clinic being a little more conservative. I'll tell you what, though, I began to worry about our position when Wichita happened. Because I tell you, it took pro-choice people forever to get organized in Wichita. Wouldn't you agree? You were there. I was worried. I felt badly that we took so long. And I'll tell you, they didn't want us in. First of all, the folks there didn't want us to come. And they didn't want national people there. And I really respect that. You just don't go barreling, bigfooting in. And so we stayed out. But I'll tell you, what happened was they had a full force there, and we were made to look like we were in the minority. And so we can't let that happen again. But that's why we're working on Buffalo right now, and we're working with the coalition. We're planning our strategy. The clinics will be a part of it. I don't know whether we're going to end up with a big demonstration. We'll probably have a demonstration, but not at the clinic. The goal has to be to keep the patients protected and their entryway unblocked, and we need the police to do that. But there are differences of opinion. I will tell you, though, when Roe is overturned, when we lose the right, civil disobedience is going to be the name of the game here, as well as political action. We're going to have to break the law. And I mean nonviolently break the law, but break the law. And we will have to demonstrate. Now, my course hope is that we not only do that, but we forcefully activate the political process. So there's no easy answer. It's unfortunate that they can't get together in a particular community. But different groups have different styles.
Unfortunately, what now ended up saying to Planned Parenthood was, you just don't understand the issue.
Well, see, I don't think that's helpful, because I was an executive director of a Planned Parenthood facility, and I know what it is. Those of us here who have been in this situation know what it is like, and it's a whole different thing when you're on the inside and you've got a business to run and you've got patients to serve, and it's not as easy. Anyway, hi.
In the Democratic response to the State of the Union address, Speaker Foley vowed that in the face of an overturn for Roe v. Wade, he would pass legislation. The Democrats would push and pass legislation to protect our right to choose. I think we all have some reason, valid reason, to be skeptical based on Congress's performance in recent years. Could you talk a little in more detail about the prospects for the Freedom of Choice Act and what we can do, both as interested citizens and here at the Kennedy School, to ensure that those words, that rhetoric, gets translated into action?
The Freedom of Choice Act is indeed the most vital piece of legislation that I think is before Congress today. It is now in the House, in the Judiciary Committee, and in the Senate it is in the Labor HHS Committee, Kennedy's Committee. So what we're trying to do is make sure the timing coincides with the court's movement a bit around the Pennsylvania case, so we have that backdrop. Because you know Congress, they don't do anything unless there's a real urgency. And you know, without the court acting, it'll feel like to them, well, why bother? But I think we have 25 or 27 or maybe 33 right now. Maybe, I don't remember. I think it may be over 30 now, co-sponsors in the Senate and 125 in the House. That's a long way from where we need to be. So the first order of business is making sure that every member of your delegation knows that you need him or her on the Freedom of Choice Act. When we start to move it, the goal is to get it on the President's desk, frankly, in September. We want him to have to veto. We know he's going to veto. We want him to have to veto before the election. We also want it to put on record every one of the House members, every one of the Senate members, because there's no more dancing and dodging on this issue. The court is not there as a shield anymore. And what we're hearing from anti-choice politicians when they get challenged about their issue and people are saying to them, gee, the right to choose is going to be an important issue in your race. These are Congress people running. They say, oh, no. The court is going to give it back to the states. It's a state issue. It's not a federal issue anymore. That's what we've been hearing. So we know what their line is going to be. And we need to come right in with the Freedom of Choice Act. And we need to, so what you need to understand is that until we get a pro-choice president, we're not going to sign it into law. But as a political tool, it will be very valuable. And we need you to make sure, if you can take on as a challenge, first of all, finding out where the Massachusetts delegation is and making sure that those who aren't on have heard from you and 10 others that you could organize, that you will not vote for them unless they're on the Freedom of Choice. That's going to be the defining issue. And I think that's the most important thing, is that it has to be an election issue.
Is the Speaker on the bill?
Actually,
that'll be our first line of business.
That's a very good question. George Mitchell is not on the bill. He will be, I hope, soon, because we've been lobbying him. But I'm embarrassed to tell you, I don't know, but I don't think so.
I don't think so.
I have a feeling he is not currently on the bill. Now, I could be wrong. Maybe after he made that statement, there was activity. I can't remember. Kerry wasn't on until about 3 weeks ago. Bob Kerry running for president. He's now on. So, yes, you could, the Speaker, if you could target the Speaker to make sure you reinforce for him, that was a very big statement he made. A very big, for the Speaker of the House, who's not real comfortable with the issue of abortion. He's pro-choice, but he's uncomfortable with the issue. For him to say so strongly what he said, he needs to hear from you about how positive that was and how important that was, and that you're going to be there to help him pass this legislation. Because that's what they're worried about. He and Mitchell both are worried that this legislation will fail. It'll be amended so badly that we will have no right left. I'm worried that if we can't get filibuster-proof Senate, Helms is going to filibuster this to death. We've got a lot of obstacles to overcome, but I think we can manage it.
We're going to take 2 more questions and then...
Oh, could I just ask this woman just before, and then I'll come to you. I'm sorry. She's been wanting to speak.
Sure.
We all know that Pat Buchanan is running on Republican, but he is conservative on some issues and liberal, very liberal on others. He tends to be more conservative. Do you know what his policy is?
Pat Buchanan is rabidly anti-abortion. He is. It wouldn't matter if the woman was barely breathing and was going to die. And you know what worried me about the November elections? About the New Hampshire? I was in New Hampshire. Where was I? In any case, I heard on the news from New Hampshire that night of the election, the other night, that Republican women voted for Bush because of Buchanan's anti-abortion stance. I thought, oh boy. Well, the fact is that 52% of the American public do not know George Bush's stand. I don't know how they don't know. Ask the question about our work and education. We have work to do, but Buchanan is terrible. Oh.
Ms. Michaelman, in your speech, you say that many women, and I would add men as well to that list, are afraid of the word feminist because it's developed a negative connotation.
Right.
Now, many would say that that's because the leadership of the women's movement is out of step with the goals of most women and men who sympathize with them. Do you believe this is a false perception? And if you do, or if you don't, how do you propose to deal with it?
Well, I do think, I must say, I do think it's a false perception. I have always worried about the word feminist because I think in the minds of people it was somehow associated with anti-family, anti-children, anti-all the values that we all hold fairly strongly. And I'm beginning to understand better how that got translated. Partly it was the way in which the movement started, and partly it was this right-wing counter-assault that translated the work that we were doing to advance women into this anti-family, anti-children, anti-this notion. And so feminism became an uncomfortable word for people. I can tell you and speak from my point of view and from many other women colleagues that I have who work in this field that it is a false perception. And we are fighting a terrible, we're fighting against the Heritage Foundation and people like them. And the media has contributed by buying into this and by painting us like this, that we're, that we're not responsive to the goals and the aspirations of young men and women. We are. And when we do focus groups, I have to tell you, and I said this in my speech, in Middle America, I mean, you use the word feminist and they die. I mean, but then you start discerning the issues that embodies feminism, and if you mean feminism as advocacy on behalf of women, women's lives, and equality, they're right there. It's just the word has grown to feel very badly, but I do think it's a false perception, but perceptions are created by a lot of different forces, and in some ways, I will say that maybe some of us did contribute to those perceptions being developed. And I know that we need to work hard to make sure that our thoughts are communicated effectively so that we're not sending any messages that would exacerbate this view about feminism. I don't normally, by the way, go out and talk about feminism. It's not important to me. I don't care what you call it. I talk about the issues. I don't really care what you call it, but it bothers me that we've had this successful campaign to paint women who are feminists and men who are feminists, meaning the values embodying feminists, as somehow demons, that we're awful. So that bothers me. And so tonight, wrote this because I've begun to be more concerned about it, but I normally don't spend my time worrying about the label feminism.
Can I ask a brief follow-up, or should
sure.
I? Okay. Patricia Ireland has said that one of the primary goals of now will now be lesbian rights, and you said tonight in your speech that a fundamental right for women is a fundamental right to choose.
That is right. I believe that.
Now, in light of the fact that, according to most polls at least, the number one goal of most women is equal hiring wages, equal wages, or the end of discriminatory hiring practices, and that depending on the poll you read, anywhere from 35 to 50% of women are against abortion. How do you explain?
What poll are you doing, babe?
Gallup, New York
Gallup?
Times.
Let me tell you, that is absolutely false.
Okay.
To say 35 to 50% of women, that is absolutely patently false. That's inaccurate, wrong. First of all, well, I don't mean to put you down. I'm just saying that is wrong. And 65 to 70% of the American public, when you ask them the question who should decide in the case of a pregnancy, whether or not abortion is a choice, there's 65 to 70 people say women, not the politicians. And there's a higher percentage of women who say that. And we just did our latest poll. We do polling all of the time. And we just did our latest poll in December. And those figures are just not correct. And Gallup did a poll that was not very accurate, by the way. It was actually for a group. But women do have other issues that concern them. But when you ask them about the right to choose, and it gets localized in their minds, it rises up there as a very important issue. But it's not the only issue, but it's going to be one of the defining issues in this race. But there are other issues. But what I said to you, I believe, and maybe not everyone understands it, but if we lose our right to choose, our right to make reproductive choices, wage issues, working hours, none of the others are going to matter, because if we can't control our destiny, who cares? I mean, not who cares, but we just don't have the power then to effectuate other kinds of changes. And that's my belief. That's why I work on this issue, because I think it is a fundamental and basic right that is the foundation of all others. And we may disagree, some of us, on that, but and women are there. Women are there. They may not say it right off, but they're there. So thank you.
We just make a few.
This is Kennedy Students for Choice and Harvard undergraduate Students for Choice. Two quick announcements. First is pick up a leaflet on your way out. There's going to be an organizing meeting for the March on Washington here in Land Hall next Wednesday night at 7 o'clock. Representatives from NOW will be here to talk about our organizing in the area and want to get everybody in the community, both Cambridge and the college community, involved. Secondly, and I want to turn it over to the Harvard undergrads for a second to make a quick announcement about transportation. But to follow up on your last question, I can't let it go by without saying that Patricia Ireland will be here on Monday, March 16th, so you can ask her directly about NOW's agenda and why her statement is not that it will be, why lesbian rights will not be it's not going to supplant other issues on our agenda, that it is there along with, and it is the same issue of a right to privacy and a right to control our own bodies, and also getting back to the issue of sex, which you brought up, which we all seem to be a little scared to talk about. So join us next Wednesday night, 7 o'clock for the meeting. And
first, I just want to say hi, Kate. It was good to see you this year, back again. We are having a meeting on Tuesday for undergraduates, next Tuesday at 8 p.m. in Tickner Lounge.
And graduates.
Yeah, and graduates too, although we're primarily an undergraduate group, to organize also on our part. And we're also having buses, which Jessica will talk about.
We're organizing buses to go down for the march, and we're expecting 12,000. And
great.
We want you all to come. So look for posters and signs, sign up. I'm Jessica Yellen. This is Julie Bornstein. If you have questions, please come.
Now I'd like to invite all of you to a reception sponsored by the Women's Caucus and the IOP in the IOP living room, which is to the left of those exit signs. And Kate Michaelman will be there for the first part of the reception, so you can ask her more questions.